we're going to kind of get off maybe the history tangent of what you consider regular American history. And we're going to have a short lecture on the counterculture movement and a quiz this week. And then we're going to move on to what I call the colorful and colorless 1960s. We're going to talk about violence in the 60s, drug use in the 60s, fashions in the 60s, a little bit of sports in the 60s, Woodstock, not Woodstock, but the drug culture, the music culture. We'll talk about artists in the 60s, those types of things. It's a really kind of a fun period that doesn't really talk about specific events in history. It does the things that went on during the 1960s. So we'll start out with the counterculture movement. Anybody know what the counterculture movement means? What does counterculture mean? Say it. Against what would be seen as normal. Okay? You got to remember that the 1950s were much different than the 1960s. So the counterculture movement was actually made up of people that wanted to change the way culture had been in the past, and it was made up by youth. The people that made up the counterculture movement were youth. They were kids in their teens, later teens, 20s, 30s. They were the younger generation of America. Now I want to ask you a question. There's several social classes in America. You've got the upper class, and you've got the lower class, and then you've got the middle class, and then you have the upper middle class, and then you have the lower middle class. You have lots of different types of kids and people that are in classes. What type of social group do you think that these youths came out of that made up the counterculture movement? What were they? I want you to think. So let's take a little vote here. Okay, here's upper middle, lower middle, and lower. So Allison, what is your guess? What type of people made up this group of kids that got involved in counterculture? What type of people?
Probably like middle,
lower middle? Okay. What do you think? Lower middle? Sadria? Okay. Braden?
Upper middle.
Upper middle. Okay. What do you say, Hannah?
like middle.
Middle?
Lower.
Lower class? Okay. What do you say? Emma? Emmy? Emma?
Upper middle.
Upper middle. Okay. What do you say? Upper middle? Emily?
Upper middle.
Upper middle. Okay. What do you say?
Lower
Lower
middle.
middle?
Middle.
Middle? Jacob?
Lower middle.
Lower middle? And middle? Jewel?
Middle.
Levi?
Lower.
Okay. Aaron?
Upper.
Emery? Emery's not, okay.
Middle.
Alex, middle. What do you think, Carmen?
Lower middle.
Lower middle. And what do you think, Miss Opinion?
Lower middle.
Lower middle. You know, this is not uncommon, what I get every year when we guess on this. Surprisingly, the counterculture movement came out of the upper middle class youth. Most people blame the lower class and the middle lower class.
John Lennon and Sharon Tate, they were part of that movement in their upper class.
Well, maybe. Yeah, well, that's
Upper
okay.
middle.
But anyway, that's the upper middle class youth. Now, these are youth, okay? Now, does anybody know, if you probably don't because I'm getting older and you're staying the same age. What was the biggest symbol of the counterculture movement in males? You could tell right away it was the biggest shocking change in males from the 50s. What?
Hair.
Long hair. Long hair on males was the absolute biggest symbol of the counterculture in both boys and girls. Boys started growing their hair long. In the 50s were boys' hair long. It's kind of funny because we've kind of reverted back. You don't see a lot of long-haired boys now. A few, but not a lot. Now, this long hair became a symbol of defiance between the youth of America and adult authority. Without question. I'll tell you a couple stories here.
Is this under the noun generation?
Yeah, we haven't got there yet. We're just kind of talking in general. So, this long hair became an incredible symbol of defiance between the youth of America and adult authority. Even though it was mainly on boys that mattered, it kind of covered the whole thing. Now, what did this defiance, and we'll get into fashions in the 60s a little bit later, but what did this defiance lead to in schools that we even have today? Some things have changed. We still enforce this today in schools. Dress code. This is where dress codes in school came into being. You didn't really have dress codes in school in the 40s and 50s. Kids wore what people considered normal clothing to school in the 40s and 50s. Dress codes came in. Okay? Now, I'll never forget this. I was a 7th grader. I've already told you the Lenore Larson story of the miniskirts. Didn't I tell you that story earlier in the year? I didn't. Okay. Well, we'll get into fashions, but girls, the symbol of defiance among girls at this time was they wore the shortest dresses you could imagine. They were called miniskirts, and we'll get into those later. But I mean, didn't leave much to the imagination. It was like a t-shirt that girls would wear to bed. Anyway, I'll never forget when I was a 7th grader, I went into Forsyth High School because it was a 7-12 school. You know, how old are you when you're in 7th grade? 13? 12 or 13? My first vision of walking in was Roger Birdall getting kicked out of school because he wouldn't get his hair cut. As I walked out in, he was mad walking out. It was a big scene. And the second thing I remember is Principal Ed Goyette sending Lenore Larson home because she had a miniskirt on. And I mean, my first sight as a 7th grader was a bright yellow miniskirt on the best looking blonde I'd ever seen that was about 6 foot tall. And I'm going, welcome to high school, baby. Anyway, but the point being is Roger Birdall got in trouble because he would not cut his hair. And so he got suspended out of school for having hair over his ears. And he spent the rest of the day in protest, I'll never forget this, riding his motorcycle up and down Main Street of Forsyth. I mean, all day long. Lenore went home, and I don't remember she ever came back. I was hoping she would, but she didn't. I don't believe. But that was my first symbol to the dress code when I was in 7th grade. Then another thing happened to me in 1994. This is, you know, past the 60s a ways. I interview and get the principal job at Fort Benton High School. And they had a lot of problems there, and I was told you need to fix the attendance, you need to fix the discipline, you need to fix this, you need to fix that, you need to fix this. Well, it's tough to come into school and just hammer on everything that hasn't been taken care of before, because I had replaced a really long-time principal who was, you know, you get late in your career and you don't care. But things were getting kind of crappy. So I'm thinking to myself, my God, what in the world could I give to these kids that maybe they don't get now that might make it a little easier for me to come in and change this and this and this? So I brought in Molly Gaymar, who was the student body president, great gal, and I sat her down and I said, Molly, listen, I'm going to come in here and we're going to change a lot of the culture here, and your kids are going to revolt a little bit, and I just want to know what is, there's something that you don't like right now within reason I could change. Oh, I tell you, Mr. I tell you, we're upset. I said, what are you upset about? These boys can't grow facial hair. Mr. Meisner would not let them grow facial hair. Boys were suspended out of school in 1994 in Fort Bend for wearing facial hair. Okay, and I'm thinking, really? I mean, this is 1994. But that's how old-fashioned was. He didn't care if the kids were out of control because they weren't wearing any facial hair. So I thought to myself, well, I'm getting lucky here. So I said, well, Molly, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll get rid of the facial hair rule. In exchange for you explain to the student body that we're going to make some other changes here. I was the hero of the century for that. I couldn't believe it. So for about 2 weeks, we had the mangiest looking beards and mustaches, and then kids just shaved them off. Sam Rankin, this is what you get when you get old. Sam Rankin was the only kid I remember, and he kept a mustache. He kept a mustache, okay? And he was the only kid that had facial hair the rest of the year, but it was the idea of we can do it, right? So dress codes came into effect because of this. We just barely started, Ashton, so you're in good shape. We're talking about the counterculture movement. They involved upper middle class youth. The biggest symbol of defiance on the part of males in the counterculture was they grew long hair for the first time. Girls started wearing short dresses like miniskirts. That was probably the girls' big symbol of defiance. And we're talking about how this resulted in dress codes coming into schools for the first time. Well, anyway, this young upper middle class people that were involved in this counterculture movement became known as the Now Generation. And that's what, Allison, we're going to get into the subtopic. So the Now Generation is this group of upper middle class youth that are kind of revolting against what the norm is. Okay? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 7 beliefs that the Now Generation had that really went against the grain of decades before. Okay? 7 beliefs that the now generation had that went against the beliefs of decades before? Now again, remember, the now generation are these upper middle class youths of the counterculture. Okay? Number one, first of all, they would have no interest in listening to me in this class today. Because the number one, not number one, but one of the 7 beliefs is they considered the past as completely useless, not worth notice, or not worth study. So do you think the now generation would be interested in a history class? Not at all. So one of their beliefs is they believed that the past was completely useless, not worth notice, or not worth study. So they would not have been interested in any history courses. The second belief they had is they became more interested in subject areas like mythology, astrology, and religion. Now, I'm not saying these are bad, but they were a tremendous change from years before. So they became interested in mythology, astrology, and religion. Mauricio, you feel free to pop up if you need to again. Okay? So that was the second one. Where's that card end up over here? I think Ashton's got to sign it and Mauricio. Okay? Now, that leads us to our third belief of the now generation. They lost interest in the 4 cores. They lost interest in math, science, language arts, and social studies. So they lost interest in the cores, was number 3, and number 2 is they gained interest in mythology, astrology, and religion. So they consider the past as useless, not worth notice or study. They become more interested in subjects like mythology, astrology, and religion. And number 3 is they lose all interest in the 4 cores: math, science, English, social studies. Number 4, they had a very, very anti-scientific attitude. Very, very anti-scientific attitude. Number 5, they had a very strong rejection toward leadership. They had a very strong rejection toward leadership. They did not listen to people that were in leadership positions, did not respect people in leadership positions. So they had a very strong rejection towards leadership. Number 6, they were, though, concerned about pollution and the environment. They were very concerned about pollution and the environment. How many is that? 6? Very concerned about pollution and the environment. And 7, they believed in a no-growth economy. They believed in a no-growth economy. But that's kind of an interesting thing in itself. Try to think what you think. When you look at their philosophy, tell me what you think it means if they believe in a no-growth economy. What do you think, Ashton? You shouldn't have came today. Is that what you're thinking?
No one knows.
What do you think by a no-growth economy?
So we should just stay where we're at, not.
What's that?
We should just stay where we're at as an economy, not grow and.
Okay, you're close. It doesn't have really anything to do with the economy. It has more to do with growth.
They don't want more buildings and stuff. They want to be like nature and trees and not ruin their.
They don't want more something, but not buildings. It has not a lot to do with the economy.
More.
They don't want more people. They believed in stabilizing the economy, or stabilizing the population of the United States. Their no-growth economy was, let's push for not having a lot of kids. Matter of fact, they wore buttons that said, stop at 2. So the 7th thing is they believed in a no-growth economy. They wanted to stabilize the population of the United States. And they even wore buttons. Yeah, they wouldn't have belonged to the Mormon or Catholic churches. But anyway, they believed in stabilizing the population, and they wore buttons even that said, stop at 2. Those were the 7 beliefs of the now generation. Those middle-class youths that made up the counterculture. Okay? We're going to move on to our second subtopic, which is the sexual revolution. Now, this is a little edgy, but it's part of the thing you need to know about the 60s, because this was a big part of it, and it influences today. Now, the now generation, those middle-class youths, were the ones that really led to the beginning of what we became known as the sexual revolution. And basically what the sexual revolution was, is people's attitudes towards sexuality became more open. Okay? People's attitudes towards sexuality became more open. I'll give you some examples of that. You're going to think this is just the norm, but this wasn't the norm coming from the decade of the 1950s. Okay, I'll give you an example of attitudes becoming more open on sexuality. Number one, being nude and seeing people nude became more and more accepted. Okay? Now, what is the biggest thing you fight in a dress code right now, especially among girls? What? Cleavage, okay? That's an example of attitudes towards sexuality changing, okay? Okay, you didn't see, that wasn't part of the dress code in the 1950s. That wasn't anything you worried about. A lot of kids wore uniforms at school. So being nude and being seen nude became more and more acceptable. Now, what would be the best example of that, besides the dress code? What? Kind of. Not that extent. Where did nudity become more evident? Movies, not so much TV, because you remember this, the 60s, and TV was just coming up. So movies, films were probably, the film industry was the best example of the nudity, okay? And unbelievable to those that grew up in the 40s and 50s, frontal nudity in films started to target what generation? Teens and young adults. So you start to see frontal nudity in filming, in movies. Okay, that was not the case prior. And because of that, what came up for the first time in films? Ratings. Very good. So because of this being nude and being seen nude more prevalent in the sexual revolution, especially in the film industry, frontal nudity, rating systems were developed, and it happened in 1967. 1967. Now I'll tell you what, the first 4 ratings were as follows, and they're a little bit different now. Maybe you know them better than I do. G was the rating. And we have G today, don't we? Still have G, right? The second rating in 1967 was M for mature. What do we probably call that now? PG-13. Now, do we have G? Don't we have G, PG, PG-13, R, and then X, right? Is that what we have now, or do they even call it X? I don't know. But anyway, yeah, M was the second one. The third one was R, restricted. Okay, so you had G, M, and R, and then X. So you only had 4 ratings. You didn't have the PG, the PG-13, etc. Okay, those were the 4 ratings, and those came out in films in 1967 because of the frontal nudity that was being shown in motion pictures. Okay, another thing that was big in the sexual revolution was what? Wasn't really very well known, or nobody admitted to taking it. Birth control. Very good. Birth control pill was big in the sexual revolution. Matter of fact, historians will tell you that probably the most important drug any kid took in the 1960s, and we're going to talk about many, was the birth control pill. So, historians stated that the most important drug taken during the decade of the 1960s could have certainly been the birth control pill, because that wasn't something that was real common nor publicized too much in the 50s. It became a big deal in the 60s. Now, because of open sexuality, birth control, what else became a reality during the sexual revolution? Well, no. They really, no, honestly, they just happened. We'll talk about that. What did people get as a result of the free time they were having?
STDs.
Yes, in that time they were called venereal disease. We call them STDs now. It was called venereal disease at that time. And it really became a reality, and it spread like wildfire across the country, especially in the San Francisco area, which we'll be talking about here in a bit. So venereal disease became a big problem in the 60s during the sexual revolution. Other names for that were the clap. You ever heard? You're too young to know that, but the clap was something they called it. DD. Okay, those are some things that were pretty wild in the 60s. Now, another thing that happened in the sexual revolution of the 60s was for the first time we saw irresponsible adults and parenting. Irresponsible adults and parenting. And what rose by the thousands in the 1960s compared to the 1950s? Unwed mothers. Okay? In the 1950s, if you were an unwed mother, it was a bad deal. I'm going to tell you a story. My first year of teaching at Colstrip High School in 1981, we had a girl that actually had the gall to think that she was going to come to school pregnant. Because in those days, you had to announce that you were pregnant, and they suspended you and expelled you out of school. I'm not making that up. I have my wife's handbook from Moreland High School in 1976, and it says right in the handbook, any girl discovers she has become pregnant must inform the administration immediately for expulsion. It says right in the handbook. So this is where this thing with unwed mothers began to happen, and it rose by the thousands, hundreds of thousands from the decades before. And why? Young men in the old days, if you happened to get yourself in that position, you did the right thing and you married the girl, and whether you liked her or not, you went on with life. Is that the case today? It started in the 1960s. Young men fathered children and took absolutely no responsibility. That's where this started. I saw a thing on TV the other day, they were making fun of the difference between being a father and being a baby dad. I didn't even understand that term. Baby dad, is that what it's called? Baby daddy? Baby daddy. That there's a difference between that. This started, kids, honestly, it started in the 1960s. These attitudes towards sexuality, and it's okay to be an unwed mother, and it's okay for the father to be irresponsible. Matter of fact,